Hello, Green Dreamers. If you're new to my channel, my name is Annie, and I'm a musician who has lived in this tiny home, the Green Dream, since 2017. Today, I wanted to answer some frequently asked questions about tiny house life.
Welcome to the Green Dream, the Green Dream. Welcome to the Green Dream, the Green Dream. Everyday tiny house living with Annie C in the Green Dream.
Did you build your tiny house? I think this is probably the most common question that I get because there are so many incredible tiny house builders. But I did not build this house. I worked with some builders who had a lot of experience, and I considered some different options. I looked at used homes. I looked at tiny home shells where you can sort of build out the interior of the house. And for me, I just don't have a lot of building experience. And when I did a little bit of research, sort of the theme that I saw over and over was it took people a lot longer than they expected. They tended to spend a lot more money than they expected. So for me, that wasn't the best choice. But if you do have building experience and you want to take a go at it, I think it seems like a wonderful adventure. The builders that I worked with for this house are Tiny Mountain Homes. They are based out of Salem, Oregon. And they had sort of an existing model that we kind of modified. So the part that you see behind me in the original model was actually a little tiny cute outdoor porch, which would have made the interior closer to about 18 feet. And we decided to build that out. And I also added a little bit of length in the storage loft. And I have to say, those were really critical adjustments for me and the gear and the possessions that I have. This is really kind of the music space and couch space. So that was really a critical adjustment for my purposes. Did you have to get rid of most of your stuff? So prior to moving into this tiny house, I had been renting rooms in different spaces. And so for the most part, I had to stay confined to a room in someone's house. So I didn't have a lot of furniture or anything like that. And I also did a bit of couch surfing and house sitting in the months before I moved into the house. For me, books were always the biggest challenge. And I found that after each subsequent move, I would give away more and more books to the point that for a while, I kept the books that I had up in the storage loft, and I had a couple in the sleeping loft. Now that I have my cabinet space, I do have a place for more of my music books. But that was probably the biggest sort of winnowing that I did. I think I did get rid of some clothes and shoes, but it was a really gradual process for me. And I would say my advice for people in thinking about what they want to keep is really think about what you use frequently, what you use on a daily basis, and start making lists. Start making lists of things that you absolutely couldn't live without, sort of a maybe list, things you might keep, you might give away, and your list of things you're going to give away. And also you can think about things that you could perhaps borrow from other people or share. So really try to take stock of what you have and figure out how much you can downsize. Is it legal to live in a tiny home? So this is a really big question, and it varies widely depending on where you live. I live in Portland, Oregon, and when I moved into the house, people described it to me as pre-legal, which I really enjoy that word, in that it wasn't technically illegal, but it also wasn't technically legal. And so when I was looking for spaces, looking to be a little bit more stealth or not necessarily easily visible from the road was a consideration. Since I moved in, it is now legal to live in an RV or a tiny home as part of, in the back of a main house or connected to the main house in some way, as long as you have permission from the owner, which you would definitely want to have. So it is no longer pre-legal where I live, but definitely look into the codes where you are. I think the main creative solution people have found is an arrangement like mine where I am basically in the yard of a main house. So there are things you can do as far as saying, oh, it's, my plan, if I did have any trouble, was to say, oh, it's a backyard studio, which it technically is, but I also sleep there. So I encourage you to get creative and research the codes where you live, talk to people, see if you can find an arrangement that, while it might not be technically to code, is, no one's going to give you trouble. Because I think, part of my reason for starting this channel is we really need to get creative about different living arrangements for people with different lifestyles. Not everybody wants a big house and a mortgage, and we need to create different opportunities for people, in my opinion. How did you find a place for your tiny home? This is another super common question. And in my case, when I started thinking about going the tiny house route, I actually put an ad on Craigslist explaining who I was, the likely dimensions of my tiny house, to see if people were open to the arrangement that I did find, which is to have the tiny house connected to the main house. And I was surprised actually by how many responses that I got. I was probably getting 3 to 4 a week, and I looked at several places. I also expected to be a little bit outside of the main city, a little bit outside of Portland, and I ended up finding a place in the city proper and some really lovely folks who have hosted me since 2017. So again, I think it's a really great strategy is just start talking to people. I know actually a community that started because someone went around the neighborhood and basically knocked on doors and sent flyers out to people explaining what they wanted to do, asking if people would be willing to sell their house. So again, get creative. I think in this time of great turmoil with housing, I think to some extent, it's up to us to come up with creative solutions because things are taking a pretty long time from above. Why did you decide to live in a tiny home? I go in a little bit more detail in one of my earlier videos, but for me, I wanted to live a bit lighter on the land. I wanted to have a more private area to write and create music. And I wanted to have a more affordable living space. How big is your tiny house? So if you saw my tour video, I took a little tour of the outside of the house. The house is 8.5 feet wide, and the main part of the house is 22 feet long with a couple extra feet for the trailer. So it's 8.5 by 25 feet. For the internal space, I have just under 200 square feet as the footprint of the house, and I have 2 lofts. One is a sleeping loft and one is a storage loft. So altogether, I have about 300 square feet of usable space in the house. Do you get claustrophobic? So as I said, it's a fairly small space, 8.5 by 22 feet inside. There are some things about the house that I think make it very livable. I feel like I have really distinct living areas. So I have my storage loft, I have my workspace, sort of office in the kitchen, I have my music area and living space. And so for a small space, the house is pretty good about feeling like it has distinct areas. All of that said, I do try to get outside almost every day, and I often go do work at a coffee shop if I'm just doing sort of administrative work. So for me, that sort of helped my sanity, is getting out of the space, getting outside, which I would probably do anyway, but I think I do it with a little more frequency living in a tiny home. And the times that I have had to stay inside, so when I had COVID, that was definitely a challenge. I did put a mask on and biked around the neighborhood because I felt pretty good. But there can be times that it does feel like, okay, I need to sort of get out of the house. But I kind of have the personality that I would do that, I think, in any size dwelling. So that's been my experience. What do you do with your sewage? What do you do with the dew? So this is also a really common question, and I am actually not connected to the sewage because I have a composting toilet, and I am super happy about this. In a past life, I worked in environmental microbiology, and in my lab, we would do water quality testing, and it is insane to me that we use drinkable, potable water and poop in it. And so we amplify the volume of what's contaminated, and then we flush it, and it all goes to this big central area. They put a bunch of chemicals in it, and then they release it out into rivers, oceans, water bodies. And in a lot of places, in Portland, San Francisco, you have what are called combined sewers. So if there's a heavy rainfall, that goes into the main sewer system, and it actually can overflow and pump raw sewage into the waterways. It's a lot better in Portland now than it used to be, but I'm super happy that I'm off that part of the grid. And with my humanure, I actually take it to a local eco village that has a permitted humanure composting area. So they've been super generous in letting me take their poop there and take my poop there. And they use it on their fruit trees after it's aged and been heated up enough that the microorganisms have processed any pathogens. So I'm really happy about that. How do you stay warm? So my house actually stays pretty warm. I just have a small electric space heater and a marine propane stove. And for the most part, I stick with the electric space heater because the propane stove does use a good bit of propane. So that's what I do. And I would say the main difference between my tiny house and sort of a more regular, I don't know what to call non-tiny houses, a regular big house, is that the floor, because it's a tiny house on wheels, the floors do get a bit cold and you do lose some heat that way. I know people have some different creative solutions for that, from heated floors to basically putting, I don't know what they call it, but some sort of wood or something around the trailer so you're not getting as much heat loss underneath the house. And so at some point I would like to perhaps incorporate something like that. But my house stays really warm. It's really well sealed. When we had the really bad, we've had wildfires almost yearly at this point, but we had really bad wildfires in 2020. And I never smelled smoke in the house. So that showed me that the windows are super tight. Everything is just really tightly sealed. So if I have the heater on, I mean, I can heat the house up in 10 minutes or less. So that's a huge advantage too, is, you know, sometimes I come home and it may be a bit colder, but it does heat up pretty quickly. And I think that you'll find that downsizing to a smaller space.
Thanks for joining me today. If you want to see more about tiny house living, please subscribe to my channel. Please check out my music channel as well. I have a really silly video there about the challenges of romance in a small space. Thanks for watching. See you next time.